uh, atrocities or mishandling of the human spirit in order for us to go where we need to go. And I know that you all are understanding of where we're at today, that there's a lot of fear that we're getting ready to be divided again, but that's not the case. I mean, politically, people look at us and try to see if you're red or blue or whatever, and mainly we're purple, you know, if we really just look at it, you know. We could see ourselves siding with some conservative things or some liberal things. I mean, the balance has to be us as a people, but we first have to understand the citizens of this United States here. And we have to understand how this country was started. We have to also understand how the country is basically run culturally for us to get an understanding of how we're going to move forward. So I'm honored and happy to be here today. And my most favorite memory of fall is always football. So I mean, that's it for me, you know. When the leaves are starting to fall and stuff like that, and that's something that I like it to a degree till I'm out there trying to blow the leaves and making sure that they get back in the woods and stuff like that. And I'm going to have to do that pretty soon. But as Dr. Myers has said, I was born and raised in the city of Rochester. And I'm, let me see, maybe about a fourth generation African American that lived in the North. My mother was raised in the South, but my father and his family were raised up north here. And we go back pretty long ways in Rochester right here. We were possibly maybe some of the earliest African American folks that were in the city of Rochester. And I have my great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. His name is George Brown. And we still do commemorations for him and everything else like this. But his story, which is a dubious one, was that he was in the Confederate Army as a body soldier for a captain. You know, he had to wash this guy's underclothes out, make sure that he was fed, and did what they had to do. And in Tennessee, when the Union Army came through Tennessee, he was able to make his escape and join the Union Army. And for years, that's all that he knew. He died, I think, 1937, right in the city of Rochester. And I bring him up all the time because these things that we have to discuss, they weren't that long ago. And if we take it like this is something that happened way, way long time ago, then we won't get it. So let me start with a little bit of African American history. And I think you all know, mostly about the slave trade and everything else like that. But the atrocities of it and the pain and the syndrome that it has left, there's still scars of that today, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. And in my presentation today, I want to talk a little bit about the history, and then we want to go through post-traumatic slave syndrome that a scholar, Dr. Joy DeGruy, is using, and we're trying to use it in the city school district. And then after that, as an interactive thing, I think we can, we might be able to push these back because they're a roller. We're going to do a thing that is called concentric circles, to where we get to ask questions, important questions about what we're going today. So you all are with me, right? Okay, so the Atlantic slave trade, how many of you all know about the Atlantic slave trade? Just raise your hand. Okay, all right. And the Atlantic slave trade was the slave trade that brought millions of Africans to the western shores of the United States of America. And if you haven't understood that part of the history, I would ask that you delve into it just a little bit more to the degree to understand how folks were put into these slave ships, right? And packed to such a degree to where, I mean, you got a little space in here, but if I told everybody just to get as far as back to the room as you can get, this was the type of situation that it was. And I only say this here for those that are African American in the room. Your great-grandparents, your ancestors, right? Their resilience has it to where you're here today. They overcame that. There were a lot of folks that just jumped over, couldn't take it, couldn't take the beatings or anything else like that, and they're on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But if you're an African American person, right, your ancestors or parents, right, were in the hulls of those ships, and they survived. Tells us something about resilience, doesn't it? Yes. So when we get to the country here, right, let's just say you're here and you're chattel property. You don't own anything. Just nothing. Your clothing, anything. You just belong to a person, right? And so just picture belonging to a person for the first 245 years of this country's development, right? Little of it even before this country fought England and became free. But the first 245 years for black people was a time that still shapes the way that you see a lot of the unequal justices that possibly take place today, okay? So imagine the first 245 years. It's legal for you to get married. You can't read or write. All these things are punishable by death or public whoopings or beatings, right? And if you had children, they're taken right away from you, right? We got a little guy in here. If he was taken away from you, you would be, yeah. And you couldn't have the understanding of even having what family life is. If you had any memory of it in Africa, it was encouraged to be beaten out of you or scared out of you. And how they would do it if little children would come up to an overseer, right? And the overseer would say something like, Assalamu alaikum. If the little child would say, wa alaikum salam, they'd kill that little child right on the spot. Because they wanted to take everything that was your culture or anything that you knew and bring it up under the reforms of you just being a slave or just a pack animal. This happened for 245 years. Yes. And so this puts this country in this type of sin to say, well, let's just move on, and we know that has happened, but we've been good since then. Doesn't happen like that. Yes. Could you imagine someone taking a hammer and beating you in the face with it, and then a few people in here come along and say, hey, that's wrong, don't do that. And the person stops. And so what do? Just applaud the person for stopping? What about the damages and the scars that is left on the person that has been pummeled for all of those times and all of those years? So I'm just setting the course here. I don't want you to go dark on me. You know, I want to try to keep this thing as light as possible. But we have to have a discussion, I believe, you understand, about these type of atrocities so you can understand African American people and African American people in this country in terms of the contribution and how hard it was for them to remain resilient with the background of all of the stuff that has happened. Are you with me? Okay. So now, as we move up into history, things started happening, okay? Most folks were resigned that at least the Africans, our ancestors, they were sort of resigned to take a lot of this punishment, and there wasn't too much that they can do with it until they started organizing and was able to read. Reading is the greatest thing for the liberation of any people. And as folks were starting to read, they started to challenge the premise that white is superior and black is inferior. This was the main message on any given Sunday, right, in any given church here in America. This is where a lot of this starts. It starts right within the church, and it has this dynamic that it was up under the guile of Christianity, but really it was up under the guile, you understand, of an interpretation of Christianity that says white is superior, black is inferior. This is how it starts in the church. So folks had to start reading these things. And there was a guy, I want you to look him up and really study him, because he didn't stay around that many years. His name was David Walker. And in his appeal to the colored citizens of the nations or of the world, he said in his writings that all of these things that I'm saying to you, a lot of it is fallacy. That God did not intend for you to be the bearer of water and stuff for another person or people, based upon the story of Ham in the Bible, that black folks were supposed to be slaves, and this is the justification for it. No one can treat another human being cruel, right, unless they have a justification for it, unless they put it in their dissonance to basically do that. So they had to have a lot of propaganda back then at that time. And David Walker, in his appeal, right, he would say that this is not true. And he started uncovering a lot of these myths and a lot of these fallacies. And he started to tell folks, and this was around, I would say around maybe 1825, right? This is right into the mix to where slavery was really at its heyday. And folks were starting to even say around the 1800s that slavery was wrong. They was really starting to see the atrocities of it. But David Walker, in his appeal, he would just say to the folks that these things are fallacies, they're not true, and that God has not intended for any group to be over another group in terms of their superiority. And he also would say to the colored nations of the world is that you have a right to lash out, you understand, and fight back and kill anyone that is trying to kill you. It would be like trying to drink, it would be just like drinking a cold glass of water on a hot day. This is the thing that basically you should do. So he was putting this in pamphlets. And this guy, he was one of the more educated, at least in the terms of autodidact, not necessarily going to school, learning to count and measure, but just basically a person that was well-read. And what he would do is have these pamphlets printed up. He was a Mason, and they would put a lot of these things on trains and stuff like that and try to get them down into the South, these pamphlets. try to get this information as close as he could to the South. When the slave masters or the masters of the plantation would read this type of stuff from this person right here, they put a bounty on this person's head. Now, David Walker, his life wasn't long. He lived maybe 2-3 years, right? But in his appeal, and the reason that I mentioned him, right, because he was the first person, we believe, in the history of African Americans in this country for the liberation to free blacks from slavery. He was the first to throw the first liberation in terms of using language that would wake us up in our core and make us respond. And the reason that I say this here is that maybe about 5 years later, the first insurrection in the United States of America was Nat Turner. How many of you all heard of Nat Turner? Yeah, I think he drank a little of the Kool-Aid of David Walker, because he began to, as you know the story, he was a very, very religious man, as was David Walker. A lot of these people were folks that God basically raised, and they believed that they were his messengers. And if you believe in God sending messengers as the time as he did it biblically, you would see these persons in that same role. And so Nat Turner, he was a man of God, and he just somewhat suffered along with slavery. He was a friend to a slave master, and he kept people in order, right? And one day he had a revelation that this was all wrong. And that how would the slave master feel if his children were slaughtered in front of him, right? Or if he had to take a beating or some type of atrocity that, slave master was so cruel and stuff to the degree that a lot of things that had happened during the time in slavery is that they just wouldn't even print it because it was just so ghastly. And so with him, making a long story short, he put together a group of folks and people, and they started the insurrection in Virginia. And this is the first time, you understand, that the white race in this country felt the wrath, you understand, of the folks that they had put this type of violence and anger into. Yes. And even if you see violence and anger today, and you think that it's disproportionately in some people where it is maybe not in others, a lot of the stuff can be explained if you go back, because a lot of this slavery syndrome has been passed down today, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But after Nat Turner, then this is when everyone started to write and put their publications together. This is when the great abolitionists started to come up and move up. And the abolitionists weren't just black. They were white folks that were coming up and saying that slavery is bad. Matter of fact, the Quakers were one of the first religious groups that would put their money where their mouth is in terms of making sure that the development of the Underground Railroad was one of the things that they contributed to make sure that people could escape from the South and get into some places in the North where you can basically live. And so William Garrison, he was a great abolitionist, and a person that came up under him is the illustrious Frederick Douglass. We know that Frederick Douglass was, he somewhat put out that William Garrison was his mentor to the degree. And they had publications and papers. And the great abolitionist movement was in the North, where folks would draw massive crowds to say that slavery was wrong. And Frederick Douglass got within him the great premonition to just, he has to go out himself and articulate this here and make sure that this country see that slavery was wrong. And we know the history of Frederick Douglass. I mean, he's right here in this region. He was all over these places right here. Brockport and everything else like that. It took me a little bit to get out here to drive, you know. And I had to use the maps and everything else to get to this office or this place right here. But Frederick Douglass was all over the 9-county region in this area right here. And there's a lot of places that even right now, because they know the significance of this great man's work and stuff like that, they're starting to aggrandize these barns that he used to speak in and everything else like that. They're doing it out in Canandaigua and every other place. And just a couple weeks ago, school number 12, which sits on the homestead of where Douglass and his wife live, they've named the school Anna Murray Douglass. So he's really starting to get, as President Trump says, he's really starting to come alive, and he's doing good things, you know, Frederick Douglass. But the thing is that here's a person that devoted his life, you understand, to freeing his people. And now it's somewhat recognized in the world, but especially here locally, where he did most of his good work for 25 years, right? And so we find all of these folks in history starting to be aided. And this is when we start to see real American people come together. White folks would begin to really start to see, well, this thing is just so wrong. And one person that I would love to give a holiday for or two is John Brown. But somehow or another, the dominant society has taken John Brown and made him such a criminal for what he did for his insurrection and going up against Harper's Ferry there, stealing stuff from the militia and starting a whole, really a demonstration more so than anything else, to where this country had to start looking and saying that this thing is wrong here. We're losing some of our parishioners from this church of white supremacy. You understand? Or from this religion of white supremacy and that blacks are inferior. With the advent of John Brown and his sons. And they would go on South Avenue in Rochester, and he would go and speak with Frederick Douglass religiously on this subject right here, trying to get Frederick Douglass to lend his voice to this insurrection. And Frederick Douglass says, no, this is not the way to go. And the moment that this happened, Frederick Douglass had to go to England and live for a little while. While he was over there, he lost his daughter. His daughter passed away here. She would write him letters telling him that she hated the men that killed John Brown. John Brown used to play with Frederick Douglass's children when he was here for his long visits, trying to convert Frederick Douglass into making a raid on Harper's Ferry. So this is the history of where we're at, and there were still terrible times that folks basically had to suffer through in order to get to where we're at here, right? Now, when you were in school, did you understand the history the way that I'm trying to tell it to you now? Yeah. Okay. All right. And who knows? I may be lying. You know? According to how folks want to view or see history. But the one thing that we must say if a person is going to stand up before us and quote histories, we have to know that it's factual. So what I'm saying is factual. We can look it up, right? But the main thing that we have to understand, that it's the truth. Yes. And American history is black history. This is how the country was founded, you know. We've got to understand all the way up to the time that, and we celebrate this at the end of Kwanzaa, where Frederick Douglass prayed that President Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing all blacks and making it a thing that slavery is basically over with. And we know that the bloody war was fought and everything else to that degree. But even before this sort of takes place and happens, right, there was all types of debates on these things right here. And at the time, President Lincoln, he wasn't on the side of black people. But he said that he got converted a little later on as he was the president. People changed their thinking. It's just like folks changed their thinking on the sexual orientation of the gay community just a few years ago. You know, we know that President Obama couldn't get into to be president of the United States if he said, I'm for gay rights, right? But once he got in, he says, hey, I'm for gay rights, right? So people change based upon the information that they have and what is availed to them that is going to happen. You can almost look into the future and say that if I don't make this decision right now, we're going to have it rough down the line, okay? And so it brings us all the way up to a war was fought. There were so many heroes in terms of making this war happen. And then we get to the end of the war, which is a thing that, you know, the 13th and 14th Amendment to the Constitution, you know, it's developed and it's put in. And a lot of the southern states, in order for them to get back in during the Reconstruction period, they had to denounce that, you know, that they've seen the way and that the Union was the best way for them to go and get back into. And there was a lot of basic hatred because a lot of folks that they had in terms of slaves were now starting to be into the same public offices that they once held. And so this was a very, very terrible thing, which upset the South and a lot of people in the country. And so when these deals of the Great Compromise came about with President Johnson and the Southern Dixiecrats, it just said that we'll join the Union if you allow us just to have our state rights. And so after the Reconstruction period, a lot of this torment that black people were going through in this country, it developed once again. And then this becomes the next phase of the fight for African Americans in this country. It's called the Jim Crow era. This is where the Ku Klux Klan developed. This is where the South was separate. This is where the rights up under the law were skated around, and even the Supreme Court would weigh in on a lot of these decisions. And so it was very hard for folks that were living in the South. So the Great Migration of about 6 million people to the north put us into the ghettos of North America. And we still have the effects of that basically today, all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement and to where we see the movements today of Black Lives Matter. Now, I may have said a little something to you that took place for 400 years, right? But I want to say to you, and I'm hoping that you can understand this point right here, and we'll break a little after this before we go into the post-traumatic slave syndrome, is that for 400 years in this country, you could look at black people, or look at folks that you know that are black, right? And not one day, not 1 hour or 1 second have they ever been up under, you understand, some form of oppression or some type of a respite where they didn't have to fight for all that they have. That's a literally true statement if you really look at the country from a person that was in the hull of a slave ship, right? And they passed down their ancestry to Hanif Abdul Wahid, right? There wasn't 1 second or 1 hour where there wasn't a fight, you understand, for the decency and the respect to have truth, freedom, justice, and equality for all, for black folks and black people. And I'm hoping that what I'm saying today, not that so much that you would agree with it, but you would just think about that for a moment. Just think about that. No respite, none whatsoever. And I don't care what position that you have gotten into this country as a black person, right? You still have had that type of thing to remain and hang over you for some periods. And so if we're going to move on, one way that we really can move on is that if there's an acknowledgement collectively that this thing happened, and there has to be some type of stress or syndrome, you understand, that has developed because of it. And that if we can acknowledge that, then I think as a people, we can move on. We can move on pretty good. So let me stop and take a few questions if we want. If not, we take a bathroom break and maybe you can eat a little bit and we'll come back and we'll put you into the next thing. Is that good?
Sure.
Yes.
I have a question. So first off, thank you. This is very, very good information. I appreciate how, as a presenter, I often have to have bullet points and many slides to remind me of what to say. And the reality that your memory is so great that you've been able to benchmark a lot of these dates and these timelines and these critically impacting times, if you would, is very impressive. So thank you for that. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on a lot of what this looks like today, because it's very important to understand the historical context of a lot of these things, because it shows the starting points of how it became systemic and what we experience today. But I think it's also critically important to highlight what its face has turned to, or what the impact is now from all of those decisions and time frames that were before. So I look forward to doing that.
Well, one thing that I want you all to understand, that for any individual, any group of people, or just any individual, it's tied innately in them, right in our very soul, that we have to have truth, we have to have freedom, we have to have justice, we have to have equality. If we don't have those things, right, then we're going to lash out. Yeah, we're just not going for it, right? And so when you break down these 400 years of this country's development, and the country is relatively young, it's 240 years old, right? But for 400 years, right, blacks have been oppressed in this country. Now the country is 240 years, right? So we're talking about the years prior to that, the 160, right, to the degree. So it took 100 years just to tell the truth and get people to see that this thing that was pitched in terms of the superiority of the races and stuff like that, it is not true. That's the first 100 years. The second 100 years is that people have to be free and no one can own them. Yes. So this is how you have to sort of, this is how I've survived to sort of memorize all these things, because I took all of the things that happened, you understand, with David Walker and them to establish the truth, right? And then take it over to the next 100 years to establish how Frederick Douglass in the abolitionist movement had to fight for freedom, right? And then the justice, it took another 100 years, right? Up until the time that I was born and stuff like that. So what I'm trying to say is that now we're in the final leg of this thing, which is equality. And to Dr. Archie's point, we're going to find out that what we see today is based upon people fighting for that equality. That's where you see the little division today and stuff like that. We've already solved what the truth is, whether we want to accept it or not. And we already solved that up under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution, we can't make anybody a slave. Even if we're going to try to do that in the criminal justice system, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, right? And the justice, we won and fought that. We took away segregation. Yeah, we took away a lot of things, but even though that those things are off the books in terms of the law, they're still around. And so if you break the history down every 100 years in this country right here, you understand, then you rightfully can find your footing. But what happens is that we take it all and sort of just convolute it together. Oh, it was slavery and stuff like that. Get over it. It's, it was done a long time ago and that was it. I don't know. I think you have to look at it from the perspective of the person that was oppressed more than from the perspective of the person that we believe to be in charge, right? And we're going to go all into the privilege stuff and everything else like that. This is not to call any of us out. It's just to give us information so we can understand how it goes, because the real healing comes, once again, is that if we know, right, we'll do better. Because I think almost everyone in the room could attest to this, and I believe that the American people are like this right here, is that we could be fair-minded. If we know the truth, if we respect people's freedoms, right? If justice is surely for all, and that we're looking at a society that wants to have equality, right? If you like that, then you're all right. If you're not like that, something's wrong. Education, but they got a trade. They could do something with their hands. Because when they were coming out of slavery and stuff like that, he wanted to teach them to learn to be clean and stuff like that. And so his philosophical approach was adaptation education, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, during that time when Booker T. Washington was around, he believed that there's such thing that the educated amongst the masses, which was the talented tenth, they would go back in to teach and to do some things. And there was a little debate, which way should black folks be going, And both ways were good. It's the same thing with the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King. Malcolm X came along, right? People were sort of torn. Which way are we going to go here? What's the best way? You could take both ways and make it, but both of those ways to me presented a way that people would show their resilience, right, and move on and build something better. And this is the thing that makes me so proud of the ancestors that have come before me, is that we were never in some particular type of box, We were able to make a decision based upon the circumstances. Sometimes you have to fight because nobody's listening to you. And you all are teachers and stuff like that. You have a child in the classroom, something's happening. They'll get your attention. So I wonder why he melted down like that, Well, that was his way of doing that, But, no, but the point is that there's never been a time that we have had to challenge ourselves on what direction that we would take. We would just take the direction. And see, Martin Luther King's philosophy, as I understood it, taking it after Gandhi, is because he's seen that as a better way because it was like a mass movement, right? But later on in his life, he was a little, it looked like he was getting ready to raise a little hell. We don't know. I mean, his life was taken from him, but he certainly, you understand, wasn't turn the other cheek guy in his latter years in terms of some of his writings and the way that he presented himself. So, yes.
No, I appreciate your response to that. For me, I appreciate how you talked about both sides, and there at times being a need potentially for both strategies. So even with our current state, so working at the college, for when we start talking about change, so some people are brought to change or to understanding through policy. So our policy says X, so therefore I must follow our college's policy. Just like laws. If the law says X, I must follow the law. However, there are some people who will know what the law says, but will choose to do it not because the law says it, but because they know of the impact that you could have on people's lives if you choose not to do said action. For instance, there's a stop sign, and we talked about this. There's a stop sign. Okay, the law says I must stop at a stop sign. So that particular person say, well, I respond to laws and policies. But you can teach a law and a policy to people all you want. People still run stop signs all the time. People still don't always do everything because it's a law and policy. So it's that dual approach. So instead of it being this or that, I'm a true adamant believer in potentially this and that. So that you actually reach both groups of people that follow things because there are laws, and then other people who follow things, well, this is the why I shouldn't do it because this is the reason or who it will harm if I do it. And so it's truly being able to respond both policy-wise as well as professional development-wise or training-wise of getting people to understand the unintentional harm that could happen if we don't do it. So I think that your response of how you framed it, of looking at it more of a this and that approach versus a this or that.
It's it's preparing yourself to go outside in the weather. Yes.
Wouldn't you also argue, though, that so there is a legacy of resilience, but there's also this legacy of hope and hope in the promises that have been given throughout history. So you can go all the way back to the Revolutionary War because we know that slavery has been was for 400 years. So when the Revolutionary War came, slaves felt that that was their time for freedom, that was the fulfillment of the promise of that hope. And then the Civil War, and this is our time for freedom and the fulfillment of that promise, and that hope for the fulfillment of that promise. And then the Civil Rights era. And now you bring it to now, and the mass incarceration movement, and to end our modern day system of slavery, and still the promise of that hope. And I think that is what keeps us bottled, and what keeps the violent movements at bay, because there's always this promise of hope, or this hope for this fulfillment of this promise of freedom that never actually comes to fruition.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Getting back to what Dr. Archie was saying, that was the crux of the civil rights movement, is that there were laws in place, but I'm going to be civically disobedient to them. you know. I'm just going to sit in. I'm not going for it. There wasn't riots or anything else like that. And when we look at the freedom fighters of that time, to where they sat at the lunch counters, rode on the buses, and things to that degree, that was our next group of people that made it possible that we have African American studies, diversity, and all of those other things, because they said in a civil and disobedient type of way to do that. Now, there was no way that we were going to win our rights going up against the powerful dominant society in terms of, you know, we're just going to take up arms and do some things, you know. Even the Black Panthers understood that although they were a militant organization, right, their thing was just basically to defend the neighborhood, not to go out and assault people just for the simple fact, you understand that that was some type of a strategy. No, the strategy was to just defend. And so when we look at violence in this country, we've got all types of evidences that it just doesn't work in terms of change. Might get someone some attention, but in terms of change, it just doesn't work. But what does work that we found out in all of these periods, and I mentioned them, it took us the first 100 years for just the truth. And this was before the country was even basically established. The country's 240 years old, right? Slavery started in 1619 on these shores, right? And next year it'll be 400 years. So we get the starting of this country and the beginning of slavery mixed up. They're two different things to the degree, but in phases, this country had to develop itself. And when I try to teach history, I try to teach it to that degree, to where you'll see in all of those threads, there was hope and there was resilience each and every time that we were getting ready to make a stride into the next area. And so now that we're into, I believe, the great phase or the great hope or resilience of equality, the Black Lives Matter movements, getting out to vote, all of these things, right, that are coming up now. We're encouraging folks to vote, get out, really do what you're supposed to do. That is the result of this last phase that we have to go through so we can have really the country that we want. A country that is established on truth, freedom, justice, and equality. Those are the goals. It's not the goals to get more black people in the White House. That's not the deal. We want to have more black people empowered in the classrooms and in neighborhoods and in businesses, right? And that the systemic reasons that why a lot of this doesn't happen can be addressed. I mean, we need basically a country for all that addresses these things, that don't discriminate because of people's sexual orientation, right? Or what a person may believe religiously also too, you know? So it's that type of thing, and we can only lend ourselves to being that type of people if we examine what has happened in the past so we don't repeat that in the future. And folks that have been oppressed, you really, really have to become aware of that and friends with them to get them out of that. Because the syndrome, you understand, of what has happened in this country, if we could hypothetically switch it around, a lot of people wouldn't survive that. Other groups of people possibly couldn't do that. And it's one thing about the ancestry of African American people that a lot of us are proud of, and that we want folks to know. And it's important that people know this here, is that we're a people that have come from so down low to a good station and position in life. And the only way that we can get to the final destiny for us, which is our dignity, is that if we all help us to get there. It's not just us fighting and getting there alone. Nothing happened in this country without white folks or white people or other people, Native Americans or anything, joining these causes that I outlined very, very earlier to make them happen. We might have been in the lead on these things, but you're never alone when you basically see an injustice. So this is why I'm honored that you all are here and you're going through these type of curriculums so you make yourself better and we make the society better. So now I want to talk a little bit about post-traumatic slave syndrome a little bit. If we could just dim the lights a little bit, because I want you to see the presentation here. I don't.
Thanks, Jean Mary. No, underneath. Yeah. So you got one or the other. Flip it.
Oh, gotcha.
Wow.
You're up
Wow.
I was looking for a
Yeah, that's good. Is that good? Can you see? Can you see that?
Yes.
Can you read at the bottom what this says right here? This is a Swahili word. Yes. Kasira and Gira, right? And we know this word from the great Maasai warriors in Kenya. This is one of the, if you read the history of them, they're possibly one of the greatest warriors ever around. So you would see them as some type of hard folks that would chew on bones, basically. I mean, this is how the warrior mentality was, but the genuine greeting was, how are the children? This is how they would greet. And you know, I mean, we all have our different greetings and stuff like that. I mean, you know, we shake the hand and, you know, we do some of everything. And we'll see how each culture does these things. But, you know, I'm quite sure that you've all witnessed African Americans greeting each other. We sort of hug each other and, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that we know each other or anything like that, but we basically do that. But the Maasai warrior, their thing was, how are the children? Because they know that if the children are not all right, right, the society is not all right. And they would put that and make sure that you'd have to answer that question. You'd have to have the response. The children are all right. So we're going to shut down, abort the shutdown. There you go. Wow, way to go then. So, post-traumatic slave syndrome and the relationship model. This is a work by one of our scholars, Dr. Joy DeGruy. She's in Atlanta now, but she's done a lot of consultative work in the city school district. But what she's trying to get us to see that if we're going to have a better response, especially with children that are in poverty, we'll have to meet those children in such a way that we understand them and that we're willing to have a relationship in order to teach them. 77% of the teacher and staff at the Rochester City School District is white, okay? And I've got other statistics in there to tell you about maybe 65% of the students are black. And something is really wrong. And so we blame a little bit of it on the families. We have a little bit of it based upon the school and the curriculum, but most of it is based upon the relationship that the teacher has with the child, okay? And if you don't have a good relationship or understand folks who you are teaching, then this can all go awry, and no matter what we do, we'll never see the results that we're basically looking for. And so she's done this study of to look deep into all of the things that we discussed earlier and show how it develops into a syndrome to where it impacts the person that is oppressed and the folks that are oppressive. And so our biggest thing for us is, once again, is that we need to aim at the truth, okay? Because it's the foundation for good health. If you don't have truth, right, then we particularly have to go around and devise ways of surviving. If we don't believe in the truth in terms of that all of us are one, and we believe in the religion that we ascribe to, that something superior and something is inferior, and that's basically within a people and stuff like that, then it's going to be a hard go for you, because whatever you believe, right, you basically have to back that up. And then if it causes a dissonance with you to the degree, then you'll find things to justify it. It's just like cigarette smoking, right? We know over the years that they said smoking is bad for you. And at one time they said, the Surgeon General has said that it's bad for you, it could cause you health problems. And then I think the next warning, it got to the progressive thing to where, I mean, I haven't looked at a pack of cigarettes in a long time, but it'll kill you, right? But you say, oh, it's all right. I mean, if I smoke, it helps me to lose weight. It calms my nerves. You come up with something to justify you to continue to do that. And that's how we do a lot of times with these things in terms of the syndrome. Let me see if I can get it. So I think you all know what cultural competency is. Anybody can read that real quick, but I'll tell you a little bit about Carl Bell and Dominica F. McBride in a minute. Anybody want to read that? Well, nobody wants to read it, huh?
Cultural competence is the ability to effectively interact with others, regardless of cultural background, in order to achieve a goal. Cultural competence encompasses a set of skills necessary to build strong working alliances across cultures. It includes awareness, knowledge, and skills. The first component encompasses awareness of our own biases and knowledge that our biases, both tacit and known, can affect our communication with others. Knowledge includes knowing about our own cultural influences and those of the people with whom we work. This includes history, context, and cultural facets, and how these variables influence behavior.
Okay. So, as we basically can see here, I think everybody in the room is culturally competent. I'm just going to make that assumption, okay? And that you're aware of other cultures that you come in contact with, and that you go home and study about other folks and people, and you want to make sure that you understand where they're coming from and what is the thing that makes them tick. Is that a fair assumption in the room?
I would say that's a goal of this program. Yes.
Well, and that's my point. If we're ever going to work in building this utopia of one, to where we don't see color or anything else like that, or we don't see these differences that have been thrust upon us, we're going to have to come to some type of a skill set like this here. There's no way that we cannot do that. And Dr. Carl Bell, he's the president and CEO of a community mental health council. him along with Dr. McBride, what they have tried to do is put together psychiatry for people of African descent based upon the syndromes that they have gone through in terms of the African diaspora. And this is important because psychiatry, what is it, about 100 years old? 125, 150 years old or something like that? It's not that old of a science. And so when we've looked at the science of psychiatry, we really haven't dwelled into what makes folks tick based upon their environment or based upon their culture. So a lot of times we can go and be seen by a psychiatrist and may still have the same problems about that we don't fit into the society or what have you. So there are clinicians that are taking this on. Now, the philosophical aspects of cultural differences, this is a real good one here, and I would encourage you to go on YouTube and see Dr. Nichols. Edwin J. McNichols is a clinical psychologist. He's working in the organization development, and he's director of Nichols and Associated. It's an applied behavioral science. He was called into the boardrooms to try to get folks to see that there are cultural differences, not good, bad, or indifference, but if we find these things out and we know these things right, we get a better synergy of the energy and the mind of science that can help us to produce a lot of things, right? And so he put this graph together right here, looking at the ethnic groups and cultures of the world. So in this corner right here, you'll see European American, African American, Hispanics, and Arabs, Asians, Asian American, Polynesians, and Native Americans, right? And so the axiology is the member and the object, and axiology just means how does your culture somewhat define your ethics or your aesthetics, okay? And as you can see here, in the European American or European or Euro-American, the axiology is the member and the object. The highest value lies in the object or the acquisition of the object, right? Now, mind you, these are not good, bad, or indifferent, so I don't want you to think that somebody's cruel and evil because that's the axiology. But if you look down to the African American axiology, it's member to member. The highest value lies in the interpersonal relationships between persons, and I'll explain that in a minute. But to go back up to the axiology of the European is that the acquisition of the object, you understand, is how do I get the object? And when you look at European and European culture, look at Europe, it's is it relatively like a 3-season or 4-season type of environment that folks of European descent lived in? Would you say that? Yeah. So it means that they would have to grow things within the land, and you possibly have about maybe 3 months to do that. You don't have a long time to get that done, and so the acquisition of the object is to make sure that these things get in. And this is what they did for so many years in terms of trying to survive, to make sure that they got stuff in before the harvest. So you start your stuff like around May, and hopefully maybe around latter July or August, you're starting to harvest some things, right? and they would do that. The first persons that they employed, you understand, to help them do that was their wives. They were the first folks that were in servitude to their husbands. Wives had to get those plants in and get them going. Yes. And so the epistemology is that how do they know that this axiology is good for them? It's all cognitive. They know through counting and measuring. So they would count the seasons. Matter of fact, producing the almanac would do that. So when you go down to African American, member to member, the highest value lies in the interpersonal relationships between persons. I just said what the Maasai warrior would say. How are the children? That's their axiology. They wanted to know what is the relationship like between the people. And their epistemology is effective. They know one through some symbolic imagery and rhythm, if you could follow that. African Americans know things a lot of times. What is important to them is the symbolism, basically, of a thing, or the basic imagery of it. And so this is the thing that gets them to know who they are. But the logic to test all these things is that the European culture is dichotomous. It's either or. It's good and bad. It's black or white. And what happens when they set up the dichotomous of either or, right? They set the value basically on the thing that they want to have the results for. Okay? So it's just like gay and straight, right? Straight is right, gay is wrong. Just anything that would bring the logic forth. It's either or. So when you set up your dominance, you set it up according, you understand, to what you want to be valued. Are you following me? Yes, that's to the degree. And so when that is set like that, right, the processes, it's technology and everything else. And so through counting and measuring, that's how you do a thing. So years ago during slavery, when they were trying to show that whites were superior and blacks were inferior, they would take folks, right, and they can get a doctorate by putting together 2 sheets of paper on a certain subject, like the brain of a black person versus the brain of a white person. All subjective, right? None of it possibly is the truth or anything else like that, right? But they were able to make that get within the books and the curriculums at that time to increase those type of things. So this is a thing that Dr. Nichols, he does a much better job going through all of these things right here. Logic for a lot of African Americans, Hispanic and Arabs is disunital thinking, is that, disunital is like, it could be good or it could be bad, I might say, that Dr. Myers, boy, she's a bad woman, boy, And you would possibly know what I'm saying, That really she's a good person. She gets things accomplished. She gets things done, right? And that's the disunital type of thinking that other groups may have. And so they have for Asian Americans and Native Americans, their member group, the highest value lies in the cohesiveness of the group. When you see that there, when you see the Asian cultures and to the degree, everything is done according to the cohesiveness of the group. And the same things with Native Americans. So I just want you to look at the population of the United States, Monroe County population, and the Rochester population, right? And as you can see, that population will show you that whites dominate these regions, right? Do you see anything up there that would show you any difference? 68% of the population in the United States of America. African Americans is 12%, Asians are 5%, Hispanics 16%. Monroe County, 74% white, 15% African American, 3% Asian, 8% Hispanic. And then you got the Rochester population, 43% white, maybe 38 African American, and this is from the ACT Rochester website, and they was trying to show us why there's so much concentrated poverty in the city of Rochester, okay? But if you look at it by the world, much different picture. Yeah, the picture is way different when you look at it from the world. Look at the 10 most populated cities globally. Tokyo, 30 million. All of these cities right here, and none of them are dominated by white folks. Maybe New York City. Then you look at the region. Yeah. And so when you look at this here, what do you think that this tells you in terms of how we maybe somewhat see the world today, or even see our own country? Yeah. We try to go with the skewed knowledge and inference, you understand, that white is dominant. And it's dominant for the reasons that there's counting and measuring. We can measure and count how dominant we are, you know, throughout here, and we make the appearance like it's the world. You ever seen a world map? Oh, you guys are teachers. How many continents are on the world map? 7, name them. Huh?
North America, South America, Antarctica.
No, go back again. Start again.
It's interesting where I started, right?
Yeah.
North America, South America,
Right.
Antarctica, Asia, Europe, Africa.
Europe is not a continent. No, it isn't. What is a continent? A continent has to be surrounded by water, doesn't it? Europe is not a continent. Now you go back and check it out. Yeah. Well, it'll pop. Hold on. It'll possibly will be on Google as that, right? But Europe is actually Asia. Europe is actually Asia. Yes, and this is what my point is that when you count and you measure, and you can name, and you can conquer, you can name things whatever you want to name them. Yeah. Yeah. You check it out for yourself. Go back and say, well, how did this become Europe? What makes it become that, you know? When everything else is a continent and is surrounded, you know, basically by those things. I'm only saying to say this here is that in the terms of whiteness, you understand, and how we whiten things up, that's a big problem that we have to face. And what tends to happen is that if things are whitened up, then regardless, however you feel as white folks or white people, you will get the privilege of that. You can be as fair-minded as possible, but most certainly you can get to the front of the line in a lot of areas. I just want us to see this because this is the syndrome that people of color suffer from. And when they speak about it today, It sounds as though that they're whining, but they're really telling the truth. Okay? 5 myths of whiteness. Somebody read the myth of meritocracy.
The individual is the only unit of society, and that whatever a person ends up with must be what he or she wanted, worked for, earned, or deserved.
Okay. Sounds like our president, right? Yeah. How about the next one? The myth of manifest destiny.
White people were intended by God to take lands and people.
There you go. That's why it's named Europe. That's why the continent is named Europe. Okay? Because if you read the works of Peggy McIntosh, PhD, write her down because I want you to go and read all of these things that you get. When you see these references that are on here, go and look at a lot of their works, and they can explain those things to you. But the individual is the only unit of society, and that whatever a person ends up with must be what he or she deserved to work for or earn. Do you all believe that? I don't know. This is what this society is supposedly built upon. That's what they claim that it is. This society is, you know, if you get out there and go out there and get it, you should be able to have it.
You know, honey, every time I'm in this room, I always look at the back of it.
Yeah.
And I look at, and my administrators know this, you know, I look at the wall that says former superintendent of schools. And there's 7 folks up there, and I always think that whenever my picture gets put up there, hopefully not anytime soon, right? That people are gonna say, duck, 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 and then when they get to my picture, they're gonna say goose, and try and figure out, well, what happened in the history of Rockport that the landscape changed so differently, and, when I first looked back there, I thought, okay, well, a woman came on the scene, 5 superintendents, and so I could see at least my gender up there, but it's a weird feeling when I look back there. Certainly one of pride, thinking, okay, well, I was the first, but also I just think about just what our history was to get up to the point of whenever my picture goes up there, but I look at that back wall every single time I'm in this room.
And
It just reminds me of so much.
and trust me, I see it too from here. I've looked at it since I've been in here, which is the thing that I'm trying to get us to see is that if we go back and think that meritocracy is that up on the wall, then some of that may be true, but most of it, to me, I'm just saying from my perspective of how I've seen things and know the history of this country, I would believe that it's false. To that degree, because let me go back. I want you to get your timeline straight once again. Black people have been here for 400 years. We're here possibly more than a lot of immigrants that came over maybe 100 years ago. But let us know this here. The country is 240 years old, right? And when the Constitution of the United States was written, it didn't have a woman in mind, and it certainly didn't have black people in mind. Okay? Towards the end, as we fight for these things, to get better interpretation of it, right? And put the truth and the things to the test, then we get the amendments to the Constitution. Okay? We get those amendments. And that's my point and rationale is that how does things change unless you challenge them? If they don't, then we could just say, hey, Europe is a continent. Why? Because someone said so, not because the facts state them out. So let's go here. The myth of white racelessness. White people do not have race or racial experiences others do. White people are racially unmarked and therefore normal. How many of you all believe that? So have you been denied housing based upon your color? Denied entrance into a school based upon your color? Well, that's what it means when we say unmarked. Now, listen, this is the dark moment of the presentation, you know, because we're saying some things here that may make us feel uncomfortable or what have you. But I'm just saying that these things they're just truthful. They're not an indictment against white folks or white people. They're not. They're against the structures or the systems that have put out that superiority is in the races, okay? And the myth of white moral elevation. Could someone read that? It doesn't sound good when I read it. Could someone read it?
Internalized superiority. Since it is normal for us to be in charge, and there are only a few, very unusual people of color can be trusted with power.
Right. So when you go and read Dr. McIntosh's study on all these things right here, you can sort of get an understanding where she comes from. And I'm giving you all these good reads so you could do the much deeper dive, you know. Please don't see this through the lens of Hanif. Go and do the research. Yes.
If I can give an example to place the context on this. So as the College of Rockport CDO, last year was my first year, and I sent out an email to the entire institution right around this time last year that stated that as the holiday season approaches, it was an email regarding decorating for the holidays. And what I stated to the college is that I wanted us to be inclusive with our holiday decoration. So if you celebrated Christmas, make space for people who celebrate Hanukkah. Make space for people who are of the Jewish community, so that no matter what religious faith you as an individual chose to recognize or believe or honor, that we created space for everybody to have a place at that table. Actually, the year before I sent that out, we had another interim CDO who was Caucasian and who sent out an email that was similar. And actually, I derived my email from reviewing what they had sent out the year prior. But when I came along and I sent out that very same email, within 24 hours, my email was forwarded to National Fox News. National Fox News contacted our college and asked for an interview and did a story that stated that the College of Brockport has a CDO who has started a war on Christians and Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
To which they did a national story for me, highlighting, I think the first sentence says, the social justice warrior in charge at the College at Brockport was the very first sentence.
Yeah, I remember the story.
Needless to say, there was about 5,000 comments made in report of this national story. And many of them said, this is what happens when you give a minority black male a little bit of power. And amongst the many other types of death threats and comments that we received, what was the comment when you talked about moral elevation is that it's unusual when a person of color can be trusted with power. And so the uniqueness about this situation is that the year prior, someone of the Caucasian race sent out one that was exactly almost to the verbiage text similar.
Right.
But when I send it, it's now a race, it's now an attack on Christians and Christmas. So again, it's the reality of sometimes we see these things and not aware that they actually do occur. And sometimes we can dismiss them because we, within our certain seats or areas or lenses, may not be aware that these are contextual things that are occurring daily.
So the prior COO, they didn't have to experience this. They do not have race or racial experience as others do. White people are racially unmarked and therefore normal. Just based upon you putting that out, someone within the college possibly didn't even read your predecessors, just that it came from you. And you got to understand that Christmas in this country, it comes from that same body of white superiority. Yeah, it really does. Now, don't get me wrong. We all celebrate Christmas, and then, you know, I love it. I get to go to my sister's house and everything. They feed me and give me gifts. We love that part of it. But the racial connotations to it is really not something that you should raise your children, at least children of color, up in, you know. It gives people that same sense of something that's superior, you know. Naughty and nice, able to see everything that you do, just be good for goodness sakes, and everything is basically couched in that. So there's a thing today that everyone is going off and saying that these Christian values, you understand, are being attacked, and really they're not. The real Christian values that most of you all may adhere to, or know people that adhere to them, right, is the mission and vision of Christ Jesus. He wasn't as political as we see these folks trying to make things out to be or what have you. And for me, when I try to define what a good Christian is or a good Christian movement, I look at the civil rights movement. Yeah, I looked at folks that they were beaten, holes, and everything else like that, but they were still trying to stand up for justice for others. And people joined that movement, black and white people, Jewish people, and everything. So I just sort of see it that way. But internalized superiority, right? Since it is normal for us to be in charge, this is what whiteness believes, is that we're in charge. And there are only a few very unusual people of color that can be trusted with power. Dr. Myers, right? Then, you know, we have these things. And this is why we really have to change really our mindset, because the syndrome, it stays on those that are oppressed, and those that are doing the oppressing, you understand, can go stark raving mad with not coming into the times. So the myth of monoculture, okay? Can anyone read that? And this is Dr. McIntosh's work also too. Please look her up tonight whenever you get a chance right there. Anyone?
There is one American culture, and we all experience it more or less the same way. Anyone having trouble with this culture is not seeing accurately or behaving appropriately. The myth imposes an assumption and requirement on people of color. It requires them to see and feel and behave like normal, parens white people. Worse yet, it assumes that they have nothing to lose by forsaking their cultures of origin and a great deal to gain from fitting into the one normal culture. Out of many one, rather than within one, many.
Yes. Okay. So I told you that when slaves came here and they were in the hall of the slave ship or what have you, the indoctrination that they would get was that is to leave your culture back home, right? This is North America slave package that basically happened here. In South America, it's a little different. He was able to keep your rhythms, your drums, and everything else like that. In the Caribbean, those things. But here in North America, all of that was just cut out, period. Didn't want you to have any recollection or memories. Didn't want you to celebrate any holidays or anything else like that. If you're Muslim, you couldn't fast or you couldn't perform the Eid rituals or anything. All of that stuff is out of the window because the culture that everyone is supposed to accept, you understand, irregardless, right, is the culture of America. Now, ask yourself this right here, and we're going to do this when we do the concentric circles of where you're from, whether you're Irish, Italian, German, or what have you. Coming to this country as an immigrant, that was your label, right? But within 10 years, if you wanted to make it in this country, you had to become a white person. You wasn't known as a white person coming over here before that time, you know? Because when you first come here, the folks in this country didn't like you either. Didn't like your parents, didn't like your grandparents. And they would call you all types of derogatory type of names and say, this is your neighborhood that you have to live in. But you were able to get out of that situation by just labeling yourself a white person and let your other identity just go. Okay? Other than it could be in your kitchen when you're cooking your food or something like that, or, you know, you're talking with your grandmother in the native language. But other than that, just, you know, culture has a way of doing that. Okay, I can't breathe. So we're getting to the times that Dr. Archie is talking about how does this happen today? Okay, so between 2010 and 2012, Department of Defense spent $789, I mean $81 million on PSD, right? So that's post-traumatic stress disorder, those treatments. And the VA spent $8.5 billion in that same period. Now, we know what these disorders are, right? We sent people to wars. They came back. Vietnam was especially one of those wars. We trained young men to kill, right? And then when they came back, they had such a terrible disorder of it that they couldn't adjust back to society. And this is the type of money that was spent to try to get them or address what was ailing them. So $3 billion annually right now is spent on post-traumatic stress disorder. So what is PTSS? Someone read that. This is post-traumatic slave syndrome.
A condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of enslavement and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Adding to this condition is a belief, real or imagined, that the benefits of the society in which they are not accessible accessible to them.
Yes. And that's from Dr. Joy DeGruy. This is her definition of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk about right now for a minute here. PTSS produces a pattern of behavior identified by 3 categories. The first one is vacant esteem, right? There's an esteem that happens within the African American psyche to the degree that no matter how much you work or you try in the society, you're not going to be good enough or you're going to be looked over or you're not going to be chosen. Yes. And that vacancy, right, is the way that we see society set up. The way that the society is set up, we believe that it works better for the white dominant society than it works for anyone or any other race that is in the country. Is that a fair assessment? I don't know if that's the truth or not. I mean, that might not be what you experience, but I'm just saying, as a black person, I can see this here. And this order is passed all the way down. Yes. And I tell you a lot of times where this comes from. Dr. DeGrew told us one time before that she witnessed this here. And that there were two ladies in a grocery store, one black, one white. They both had their sons with them. And the sons, they went to school together. And the African-American boy, I think, was valedictorian in his school. The other boy was graduating. The white kid was graduating, either second or third within the class. And the compliments began. And so the black mother started saying to the white parent and her son, says that your son is just the greatest kid. I love him. He comes by and everything. He's just so good. He's just all good in school, and he's just, you know, his moral focus and his academic, prowess is just so good. You guys have done such an excellent job with him. And so the white lady's going to return the same compliments, right? And this black woman interrupted and says, no. He's all right. I mean, I know he's valedictorian, but that boy, you don't know the trouble that he gives me when he's at home and everything else like that, right? So this is the vacant esteem. Because what is passed down to this black mother is that if you promote your child so much, the slave master is going to take him away from you. So to protect him, right, you put him down. And this is passed down all through the generations. So you can see why she's not as proud to say, maybe it was another African-American mother, she possibly would have done that, but she went right back to the vacant esteem and said to herself, no, this guy right, because slave master, as soon as you have your children and they grow up to a certain age, if he got into a tight, he was gambling or anything or needed some money, who was the first person that he would take and can get some valued money for? It's your son. And so they'd be taken away from you, And so you have to put your kids down so they don't look like they're basically a target, right? And so the same compliment, you understand, that we have in this day and time, Dr. Archie, is what you were asking in terms of a question, is that this is what we see. We're still playing that thing out, And it happens. I mean, sad as it is. And then there's this ever-present anger that the great Baldwin used to say, that if you're a black man in this country, you're just always angry, no matter what. Someone could put ice cream in front of you, You're mad that